So, um, this show that's coming to the Met is a really long overdue um, recognition of the impact of the Harlem Renaissance. Um, and it's an interesting show in that they're setting it up in relationship to European modernism and how that kind of affected um, the development of the artists in the Harlem Renaissance. Um, so basically, there's going to be 160 works, paintings, sculptures, photography, film, um, and it's really a comprehensive show. Um, and it's basically the first one to be held in a large museum in probably 40 years. There was a show at the Studio Museum in Harlem back in the 80s, but it was nowhere near the scale of what's coming to this show. Uh, so that being said, there is so much to this that I am focusing today on three of the artists that were involved the in some way in the Harlem Renaissance. Now, William William H. Johnson, Aaron Douglas were both directly involved in the Harlem Renaissance. Archibald Motley was actually in Chicago, but to put this in context, um, the development of the arts in the northern cities came out of the Great Migration, which came in waves. Uh, with the Jim Crow laws and things like that, there was a wave of black folks getting out of the South and coming north. Um, there was a boll weevil epidemic that happened at some point in the late 1800s, and that pushed a lot of people out because the that really attacked the cotton fields. Um, so New York and Chicago were the big centers. Um, New York culturally was um, multi um, mediums. It was writing. Um, the music was jazz was just so much a part of this situation. I wish I could play some music, but we don't have the rights to do stuff like that, so I'm not going to mess around with that. But I'm just going to move along and all the artists that I've picked out, um, these three really are great to compare and contrast. Um, the actual Harlem Renaissance period was from around 1910 roughly into the 40s. It was really in its heyday from the 20s through the 30s. Um, you know, the Depression really kicked everything, but this period from around 1910 to the 1940s was really lively, raucous, productive time in Black culture. Jazz, literature, dance, the visual arts, uh, the impact of modernism can't be underestimated. Basically, you know, this um, the timing on on um, the Armory show, which took place in New York and Chicago, was 1913, and that really affected everyone, all the artists, but it was especially challenging and interesting for the black artists because of the integration into into European art and inspiration from African sources and actually multicultural sources, but a lot of it had to do with masks, with sculpture, with patterning. Um, and here are the three of them. I focused in on three of the dance dancing characters, and you could see this lively, energetic um, uh, impulse that was there. So on the left is William Johnson. I really love the guy's work. Um, Probably the most tragic of the three, but also the most buoyant and wonderful. And then in the middle is an Aaron Johnson, much more quiet, much more sedate, but nonetheless right in there. Um, the whole business of the harmonics that um, Aaron Douglas was involved in. I'll talk a lot more about when we get to him. And then there's Nightlife with Archibald Motley. This is probably the best one of his best known paintings. And we'll look at it in more depth later on too. I'm going to keep moving along because there's a lot to look at. So as I said, the exposure to European modernism and the exposure of European modernism to African masks, to primitive, quote unquote, primitive cultures. Basically, the fantasy of that. Gauguin going to Tahiti, which had already been colonized beyond recognition when he got there, but he maintained this kind of Eden-like fantasy. Um, and so here you see a William Johnson in the lower left corner, and I brought that up because it so much parallels the Blue Nude by Matisse, and then you see this mask, and you see the Picasso right next to it, and then you see Lois Mailou Jones, who was a wonderful. Actually, I think she made most of her living designing fabric, but she was a really wonderful painter also. And then there's Delaney, who actually kind of is late into the game for the Harlem Renaissance. He came up in that time and was really mature by the 30s. So um, and I thought this was a very mask-like take on James Baldwin. All right. So, um, as I said, the Great Migrations were very important aspect of what brought about the Harlem Renaissance. Um, you know, People all over the country heard about what was going on up there and wanted to get to Harlem. Um, W.E.B. Du Bois really um, focused in on the impact and use of art as a source of elevating the Black race in America. It was something that he fostered, um, and and Du Bois's rhetoric accomplishes three tasks. First, it calls into being the features of Negro art. Second, it associates Black art with a public voice and posits a Black public voice as a mode of mediation between the opposing constraints of pure art and propaganda. This mediation creates a space for public dialogue about race, culture, society. Lastly, it proposes a rational role for the norms and values of Black culture in the public deliberation of of American civil life. Um, the piece that you see below is one of the WPA murals that was done by Aaron Douglas. I just love the subtlety of his work, and there's an integration of various schools. A outgrowth of Cubism was something called synchronism. That was Robert Delaunay, and there were a couple of American artists that were doing this sort of stuff. So he integrated those abstract concepts into these representational images. Very subtle gradients, beautiful. And then, there's the storyline. Now, this is an enormous piece. This is one of three or four panels that are at the Schomburg Center at the library in New York City. They were done through the WPA, and they're gigantic. I mean, we're talking 20 by 50 feet. Um, okay. So, William Johnson um, was basically born in South Carolina, and you know, basically he had to drop out of school to help support the family. Um, when he was 17, he migrated up to New York, where his uncle to live with his uncle, and he basically did odd jobs to raise enough money so that he could go to the National Academy, and he studied there for uh, 3 years, working with various teachers, especially a teacher by the name of Charles Hawthorne, who actually is someone who ran uh, a school out in Provincetown, and through the National Academy gave classes. But um, Hawthorne saw the talent in William Johnson and just really took him under his wing, and he put his name up for a grant, and he also raised money to raise $1,000, which at that time was something close to the equivalent of about $19,000 now. Um, so between the grant and the money that Hawthorne raised, um, Johnson went to study in Paris, and he spent about a year in Paris, and then basically went to the south of France. Was very influenced by what he saw around him. Um, it was the exposure to the avant-garde, um, and one of the people that influenced especially was Hans Soutine. And here is a landscape on the left by Soutine, and you can see how Johnson has taken that kind of um, warping and movement and thrust. It's really sort of a synthesis of Van Gogh and Cézanne that is coming out in these pieces. Um, and here again, in the lower right hand corner, you see a Soutine, and you can see the use of distortion and the compositional kind of dances that he has his figures in with Johnson's work. Now this is this is really a process that he's going through. Uh, and the centerpiece is by Johnson. On the right is Vincent and the sunflowers, and on the left you see Brock and the kind of um, uh, saturated color, the paint application, that bravado that's in these paintings, um, and you can see the influence of these two on Johnson. And while in Europe, he met a woman, um, and basically, um, Holka was um, um, I believe she was from Norway, but I'm not 100% certain about that. But basically, she was of Nordic roots, and this hand colored wood block that you see, Little Talk, is a rare figurative subject, which William H. Johnson depicted himself and his wife, Holka. I'm not even going to try. I think it's Crank, but I'm not 100% certain about how to pronounce her last name. Um, in a powerful expressionistic style borrowed from the Norwegian master Edvard Munch. Johnson completed it in 1935 after a collector of Munch's work purchased a painting by Johnson and introduced Johnson and Crank to um, uh, basically to Munch. Um, so they really lived there for 3 years and traveled throughout the countryside. Um, Holka was a weaver and artist herself, um, very sophisticated. You know, she was older than Willie, um, but they really, they stayed together. They married, and that was quite a thing. Even at that time in Europe, there was a much more open um, uh, acceptance of things like that, but it's still quite a quite a um, cultural leap. And as I said, um, she's a weaver and an artist herself. Here are two pieces that I dug up of hers, which I really love a lot. This wonderful uh, portrait of Willie on the right, and then there's a design, a watercolor design for a ceramic plate. It was very large, actually. This drawing is 30 by 30. Okay. So William stayed in Europe on and off. He came back to the United States for a trip, I believe, in 1930. Went back to visit his family down in South Carolina. Didn't stay for very long. I would think that the freedom of Europe for a black man was something that really pulled him back. Um, but this particular piece is by 1938, things were getting pretty hot in Europe. And um, the work that both of them were doing was not really a Nazi cup of tea. So they both immigrated to the United States in 1938, and they, I believe it was 38 when they moved into a big studio down in Greenwich Village. And tragically, there was a fire in the building, in the studio, and I think a lot of the work that he did in Europe was destroyed in that fire. Um, but there was a freshness to what he was bringing, to what he was seeing when he came back, and you can see that in this really wonderful man in a vest. Um, this work, I just really love what he did with what he got from his European journey. Now, there were there were riots taking place in 1943 in Harlem. I can't remember what provoked it at the time. I did read it at one point, but I'm not remembering it now. But this was, one of the pieces that came out after that event. Um, and again, there's a certain kind of contemporaneousness, unfortunately, to this work. Okay. And he made repeated trips down to South Carolina to, visit the folks at home. And Lil Sis, I this piece really kind of embodies that the simplified forms of modernism that Matisse, Milton Avery, Jacob Lawrence were all kind of using these big flattened forms, and um, I just I love this wonderful piece. She's wearing um, this very squared off kind of dress, and she's there with that fly swatter to keep the flies off the baby that she's there guarding. But she's got these little gangly legs that are sticking out the bottom of the dress. There's that kind of precariousness. uh okay. And again, one of the things that that Holka brought to him was an appreciation for folk art. And in this, I see, the patterning, these stripes and all that, the kind of uh, quilt-like quality that's in this. It reminds me of G's Bend. It also reminds me very much of the Cubists. I mean, whose legs are connected to which here? They're kind of like merged together. This group on the chain gang. And again, it's very much something that he would have been seeing down south. Very much something that would have been in his experience there, and in some way must have been shocking after being in Europe to experience this again. It's funny and disturbing at the same time. Okay, and family scene, it's just straight out of a folk art portrait. Um, though compositionally it's very strong and very, there's the use of patterning, the use of the really wonderful buoyant use of color, which is something I really love in his work. He's just a brilliant colorist. uh, and the farm workers, yeah, this one, I'm looking at this thing and it's like, um they're hacking these holes in the ground, and they're bleeding. I mean, it's like, uh okay. uh Very interesting stuff. Okay, going to church. So this is not a great reproduction because there's a little bit more variation in the color in the faces and things like that than we can see in this reproduction here. But there's this thing about two and two. There's two in the front, two in the back. There's two trees in the background. There's two crosses on the hill. There's a bunch of things happening here. The other thing that he would actually have been aware of in in um in many of the African patterns in cloth and things like that, they don't allow um uh diagonals, I mean, verticals or horizontals to go straight across the entire composition of a pattern of a cloth. Um, Supposedly that lets in evil spirits. I don't know, but this is one of the things I picked up on in one of the talks that I was listening to, and it kind of makes sense to me. Um, but looking at the way these lines are broken and used in the composition reminds me again of his close study of modernism. Basically, there's also this use uh, of straight lines rather than um, perspectival lines. So the furrows in the field that are going off on this right hand side don't get narrower as they go toward the top, which is conventional perspectival Western perspectival stuff, which is interesting. So it's again pattern. Um, but look at the color and look at the jauntiness of this thing. It's just, his sense of humor is just remarkable also. Okay, so we're back to Harlem, and we're back to the nightclubs, and we're back to Jitterbug. And looking at this progression, there's a whole bunch of these. I mean, he did a lot more than I've put in here, where the progression into abstraction, more and more abstract shapes in these dancers is something to look at in here. But again, colorism, the the kind of notions about sensory crossover, about rhythms in shape and color relationship as creating um, a sense of sound, a a crossover in sensory experience. Um, I love these two over here. I'm gonna pull up the Zoom if I can. Let's see. Zoom in on these guys over here for a moment and just say, you know, what's going on here underneath that table? Those the legs of that table kind of like cross in front of and behind each other. They're these different wacky colors, the orange and the purple. Uh, and just the gesture, the look of these two. Uh, she's locked on him. He's scanning around the room. uh, that's Yeah, I wanted to close in on these a little bit so you could really see the forms. Just so wacky and wonderful. Okay. Ah, so, you know, Hubie Blake, Jelly Roll, Morton, you know, Fats Waller, Ethel Waters, Duke Ellington, Louis, uh, Ella, all these people just concentrated in the Cotton Club, the Savoy, these clubs that were just so vibrant and alive, and actually, they drew in a lot of white clientele. From my understanding, the Savoy was a black owned and run, but the Cotton Club was owned and run by some kind of mobster, and it catered more to the white crowd than to an integrated crowd. Though the performers there were all the greats. Uh, Interesting that that stuff was still going on even there, but uh, I wanted to bring in the music just for a moment, talk a little bit about it. Dizzy Gillespie again. Dizzy was toward the end of the 30s into the 40s, and I I didn't even throw in Bird or Thelonious Monk or a lot of other people that I could mention. Let's not forget about Miles Davis, who was 18 years old when he was playing with Bird. Um, so it was a vibrant scene up there. The interesting part is Harlem was a at the turn of the century a white escape from the downtown. and in the 1910s, the shift took place where um, the black population that was in the Hell's Kitchen area, like from the 40s up into 52nd Street, um, were kind of ghettoed into really kind of shabby digs, and they began to move up into Harlem, and that was where the shift took place. It was really a black middle class coming into Harlem at that time through the 20s. And basically, with the crash and all that, with 1929 and everything getting pretty desperate, things changed quite a bit. But these nightclubs were supported by black and white customers, and that was quite a thing. So we're moving on to Archibald Motley. Now, as I said, Motley was based in Chicago. He actually went to the Chicago Art Institute and was there at the Chicago Art Institute when they held the Armory show, and fellow students were up in arms about this horrible avant-garde work. They burnt um, uh, copies of Matisse's Blue Nude in effigy. Uh, Motley, on the other hand, kept kept quiet because he really liked that modernist stuff that was going on there. But he kept his own counsel, and um, didn't get into the fray on all that. Um, so he um, won a prize, um, and went to Europe, went to Paris and studied. And this is one of the pieces that he did while he was there. And then you've got this other one when he came back for the blues. Okay, and I, as I said, we were going to come back to this. This is really, it's just a fabulous painting. Um, there's so much going on in here, and I'm just, I just love the attitude that he takes. Now, there's this business about stereotyping and all that. Yeah, okay, that goes on, but um it's an admiration for the energy that's part of it. And um this whole series, he did many of these pieces. So he lived in an area called Bronzeville. Um, and let's see. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, he was born in New Orleans in 1891 and died in 1972. Um, uh, his father was a Pullman, and basically, um, they, the family moved. up to Chicago, um, and he did he did very well in school. He was very talented, as is obvious, um, and really pulled from you know the the culture that he saw around him. Now, there's this kind of zany level that still exists in Chicago art. If you know anything about artists from Chicago, that there's sort of a um, a sense of humor about a lot of the work. Um, and here is a self portrait, 1933. Ah, okay. And then there's his more serious side. Portrait of Mrs. A.G. Motley. Um, she was his wife. Basically, they met in high school and married, um, which again in America was pretty radical stance, and in some states illegal at that time still. Um, Uncle Bob is a really wonderful painting, and I'm going to take some time and talk a little bit about this one. Basically, uh, he um, Uncle Bob was actually born into slavery, and you know you can you can see the kind of um, care and warmth that Motley took to paint this painting. Um, the wonderful quality of modeling and all of that, and the care with the portrait itself. Um, and up against this kind of weathered clapboard behind him. Uh, he's holding the pipe in his right hand, and kind of gazing directly at us. There's an engagement with this guy. um, and this is a portrait of his 80-year-old grandmother, ultimately, again, born enslaved, um, on a sugar plantation in Louisiana. um, she and her family settled in Chicago. And here's another piece that he did of her from 1924, surrounded by objects that were important to her. Several different yet pivotal life experiences are represented through these objects, such as her being born into slavery. Um, to the top left of the painting is a framed portrait of a white woman, Emma Sims Kitteridge, the daughter of the slave owner and the mistress whom Motley's grandmother served. She was freed toward the end of the Civil War, 60 years prior to the painting's creation. This painting serves as an anomaly in Motley's work, But you've seen the joyful antics of some of the other paintings, the intimacy and dignity and the composure in this domestic portrait. She's not even looking at the viewer. Contrasted by the slave owner's portrait above, looking directly out at us. Um, Sitting straight and in pomp and circumstance. Uh, it's possible that Motley wanted to depict a different side of African American life through his grandmother. The life after slavery, where reminders of one's former life are always lingering nearby. I also think of Whistler's mother. I mean, in this composition, and I'm sure he was thinking of it too. Okay, and now we're on to the literary part of things. Hold fast to dreams, for if dreams die, life is a broken winged bird that cannot fly. Langston Hughes was a very close friend of Aaron Douglas. They used to go to nightclubs together and all that. Aaron Douglas was by far the most accomplished of the three in that he did he was a fixture of the Harlem Renaissance, a painter, muralist, professor, and much sought after illustrator. Douglas was originally commissioned by the Theater Arts Monthly to design a series of woodblock illustrations for Eugene O'Neill's play Emperor Jones in 1926. So you see the series of woodblocks across the bottom of the page. Those are all from that Emperor Jones um, play. Uh, and I've got a set Langston Hughes pieces and but Aaron Douglas was very sought after. There were dozens and dozens of illustrations and posters for nightclubs and this, that, and the other thing. He was also a wonderfully accomplished portrait painter. Um, but this is the big stuff. And this is, again, aspects of Negro life. Um, and the piece, again, is approximately 51 feet by 20 feet. Um, and he did these um, the one on the top is a gouache, but it's to scale. Again, it's gigantic. Um, these harmonies, these close grays that he used were really wonderfully done. Um, this these rays of light kind of um, uh, meandering through the composition and the use of transparency where where the line breaks through a form, the color changes, the tone changes. Very subtle, really wonderfully done. uh, Again, WPA mural. um, he he was he was a professor. He taught out in Kansas for a period of time, and at the end of his sort of stay in New York, he got a job with Fisk University, which is in um, God, where is it? It's down south. It's in Tennessee, um, uh, and basically he was head of the art department there. Um, so there's this kind of use of this um, curve and these linear elements to break the composition is very much a thing out of a kind of refinement used from Cubism. Um, there were a bunch of painters, as I said, Robert Delaunay, um, uh, and there was a whole school of people that were operating out of this kind of abstraction in the U.S. McDonald Wright, I believe, was the name of one of them. Beautiful harmonic rhythms. In 1931, in the midst of America's Great Depression, riding the freight trains. Well, there's a whole story here. I'm not going to read it to you. If you want to read the story, you can come back to it. But suffice it to say that uh, I believe it was 16 young black men were railroaded into jail, and this was really addressing that inequity that he saw. These are two portraits of two of the what they called the Scottsboro boys, all too familiar a story. They were blamed for rape and blah blah blah. Oh, it was nine. It was nine boys that were tied together and thrown into jail. Um, some of them were sentenced to death, which was later commuted to life sentences. But you know, and two women who were supposed to have been raped in the situation. One of them recanted, though it was too late to um, do do anything much about the damage that was done. Okay, and here is a very scarce canvas from the artist's 1930s period. Um, The Street Urchin is a beautiful example of Aaron Douglas's portrait painting. Unlike the unabashedly modern style of his mural painting, Street Urchin embodies the introspective side of the artist. From the early 1930s, Aaron Douglas painted landscapes and portraits with an impressionist brushstroke and palette. Despite his subject's poverty and the stark background, Douglas depicts this seated young man with great sensitivity and studied observation. And I'm going to leave you with this. Um, this is a William Johnson piece, and harkening back to his sunflower period with his stay with Vincent. Um, it's just a great, wonderful piece. There are a bunch of YouTubes on each of these artists, and well worth a watch. But I'm really looking forward to seeing what they put together at the Metropolitan. I'm sure they will have a really great uh, resource. So with that, I will see you uh, in 2 weeks, and have a good weekend. Oh, by the way, we are having a reception for a show with Beth DeWitt, who's got a series of acrylic paintings on in the gallery, and uh, Tony Jefferson, who is her husband, who is also a fabulous artist, and he's got a series of really beautiful patterned abstractions that are kind of drawn from Aboriginal and African sources. So This is for Black History Month. Tony is black, and Beth's work, a lot of it is ethnically mixed, but they're very provocative paintings about the ecological and racial situation that we live with. So okay, and that's it for this week. Thank you.